The skull of the most powerful man on the planet explodes in broad daylight. Exactly 48 hours later, the sole suspect is executed on live television to permanently silence his testimony. History commands you to believe the tragedy of a lone madman, but an examination of the suppressed evidence suggests a far more calculated operation. A rifle-led ambush meticulously sanitized by deeply entrenched power structures. Tens of thousands of intelligence files were heavily redacted, distorted, and locked in top-secret vaults for over half a century to protect the men truly behind the crossfire. Today we tear away those classified seals and open the archives recently dragged from the shadows, exposing the most ruthless manipulation and cover-up in American history. The psychological rupture between the elected executive and the permanent shadow state began almost immediately, forged in the humiliating disaster of the Bay of Pigs in April 1961. This operation functioned as a psychological trap engineered by the Central Intelligence Agency, an institution that had grown accustomed to operating as an autonomous branch of government under the imperious rule of Allen Dulles. The CIA's plan to overthrow Fidel Castro, utilizing a paramilitary force of Cuban exiles, was structurally unsound from its inception. Many intelligence analysts and historians argue the intelligence directors knew the exiles would be pinned down on the beaches. Some researchers conclude their true objective was extortion, calculating that the young, inexperienced president, faced with a catastrophic international humiliation and the imminent destruction of the exile force, would panic. They expected him to abandon his pledge of non-intervention and deploy the full might of the United States Armed Forces, the bombers, the Marines, the naval destroyers, to salvage the operation. They expected him to ignite a major war in the Caribbean because they believed that a president, any president, would ultimately bend to the will of the national security apparatus to save face. They miscalculated. Kennedy stood in the Oval Office, absorbing the horrific reports of death and capture, and he held the line. He refused to send the military. He absorbed the political damage, but in that singular moment of defiance, the fundamental social contract between the civilian presidency and the military-industrial complex was shattered. The psychological impact on Kennedy during those days was irreversible. The aftermath brought the chilling, visceral realization of betrayal. He looked around the cabinet room and saw men in uniform and tailored suits who were entirely willing to sacrifice human lives and risk global war simply to force his hand. He recognized the cold mechanics of a system that treated human lives as expendable currency for geopolitical dominance. His reaction was unprecedented in the modern history of the Republic. He did not simply issue a reprimand, he initiated a purge. He fired Allen Dulles, a man who had long considered himself the untouchable architect of American foreign policy. He fired the deputy director, Charles Cabell, whose brother, crucially, happened to be the mayor of Dallas. Kennedy reportedly swore to his closest aides that he would splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. To the civilian mind, this was a courageous assertion of executive authority. To the deeply entrenched power structures of Washington, it was an act of high treason. The intelligence apparatus does not forget, and it does not forgive. It archives. By threatening the autonomy, the funding, and the very existence of the agency, the president had crossed a psychological Rubicon. He was no longer viewed as the commander-in-chief. He was categorized as a systemic vulnerability, an anomaly in the algorithm of American supremacy that needed to be neutralized. This profound isolation deepened exponentially as the calendar advanced into 1962. The psychological burden of occupying a position of supreme authority while being actively undermined by one's own government is a trauma few human minds can comprehend. Kennedy was surrounded by men who spoke the language of mutually assured destruction with casual, terrifying indifference. The danger of this apparatus was rooted in its absolute detachment from the value of human life. The generals who advised him were men who had firebombed cities and calculated acceptable civilian casualties in the millions. They were a product of the Cold War machine programmed to view the world through a binary lens of absolute dominance or absolute annihilation. This ideological collision reached its terrifying apex in October 1962 during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Soviet ballistic missiles were discovered 90 miles off the coast of Florida, the military brass saw the ultimate opportunity to settle the score with communism. General Curtis LeMay and the Joint Chiefs of Staff aggressively demanded immediate, massive, surgical airstrikes, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. They knew with near certainty that such an action would trigger a retaliatory nuclear strike by the Soviet Union. They did not care. The true horror of the crisis for the commander-in-chief lay in the stark realization that his own advisors were entirely willing to trigger Armageddon to prove a strategic point. He was completely alone. He was forced to bypass his own military infrastructure, engaging in secret, back-channel diplomacy with the Soviet premier to negotiate a peaceful resolution. He traded obsolete American missiles in Turkey for the removal of the Soviet missiles in Cuba, stepping back from the abyss while his own generals raged at him for his perceived cowardice. The resolution of the missile crisis was the definitive point of no return. To the world, the president was a master statesman who had saved humanity. But within the Pentagon and the CIA, the verdict was unanimous and final. They viewed his diplomatic compromise as the ultimate surrender. They believed his reluctance to use apocalyptic force was a terminal weakness that would eventually lead to the destruction of the United States. They possessed the terrifying, righteous conviction of zealots who believe they alone are the true guardians of the empire. A man who refuses to wage war cannot be permitted to lead a nation whose economy is built on the preparation for it. The machinery of the state operates on a simple, ruthless logic. If a component threatens the survival of the whole, the component must be excised. As 1962 bled into its final bitter winter, a chilling silence settled over the subterranean corridors of power. The shouting had stopped. The bureaucratic warfare of memos and briefings ceased to matter. The system had tested the boundaries of the president's compliance, and it had found him entirely unmanageable. For the entrenched power brokers of the military-industrial complex, the ideological divide had become unbridgeable. As the era of covert manipulation failed to alter the president's trajectory, researchers argue that his removal shifted from a theoretical discussion to a logistical imperative. The illusion of Camelot was over. The escalation of hostilities moved from the abstract realm of nuclear deterrence to the very tangible reality of covert operations and financial warfare. The shadow state is not a monolith. It is a symbiotic ecosystem. The intelligence agencies, the military-industrial complex, and the powerful organized crime syndicates shared overlapping interests and a mutual hatred for the Kennedy administration. The mafia, which had utilized its considerable influence in crucial swing states to help secure Kennedy's narrow election victory, expected a massive return on their investment. They expected the administration to turn a blind eye to their operations and, crucially, to forcefully depose Fidel Castro so they could reclaim their lucrative Havana casinos. Instead of compliance, they received the ultimate betrayal. The president appointed his brother Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General. Robert Kennedy launched an unprecedented, merciless crusade against organized crime, prosecuting mob bosses and utilizing the full force of the Justice Department to dismantle the very networks that had aided his brother's campaign. Simultaneously, the CIA had been secretly collaborating with the mafia in covert operations designed to assassinate Castro, a marriage of convenience that created a highly classified subterranean network of assassins, smugglers, and black ops specialists. This network shared a unified objective: the elimination of the Kennedy brothers. By the summer of 1963, the final fatal catalyst was set into motion. Kennedy began to fundamentally disrupt the financial lifeblood of the military-industrial complex. He signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, restricting the development and testing of new, highly profitable nuclear weapons. But the absolute breaking point occurred in October 1963, when he signed National Security Action Memorandum 263. This document outlined the explicit plan to withdraw 1,000 U.S. military personnel from South Vietnam by the end of the year, with a complete withdrawal planned by 1965. This decision was a declaration of war against the defense contractors. The conflict in Southeast Asia was a billion-dollar rice bowl for companies manufacturing helicopters, munitions, and chemical defoliants. A withdrawal meant the cancellation of massive government contracts. The men who sat on the boards of these corporations were intrinsically linked to the men who sat in the Pentagon and the CIA. Kennedy was no longer just a political inconvenience. His policies threatened the financial architecture of the defense establishment. In the brutal calculus of Washington's shadow economy, interfering with military contracts crossed a fatal line, leading many to conclude that the president had been marked as a systemic liability. The operation moved into the logistical planning phase, shifting the focus from Washington to a city in Texas that would soon become the perfect kill zone. The transition from the theoretical plotting of a coup d'etat to the physical execution of a sitting president requires a highly specific theater of operations. You cannot assassinate the most heavily guarded man on the planet in a vacuum. You require a geographical environment that can be meticulously controlled, a local law enforcement apparatus that is either complicit or conveniently incompetent, and a socio-political climate so hostile to the target that the violent act appears as the natural culmination of public hatred rather than a clinical, state-sponsored execution. By the autumn of 1963, the architects of the Shadow State had found their perfect slaughterhouse, Dallas, Texas. Do not view the selection of Dallas as a tragic coincidence of scheduling. In the cold, logistical framework of an intelligence operation, Dallas was the optimal kill zone. Texas was the beating heart of the American military-industrial complex and the independent oil oligarchy. These were the very industries John F. Kennedy was actively dismantling through his tax policies, his oil depletion allowance reforms, and his executive orders to withdraw from Vietnam. The city was a stronghold of right-wing paramilitaries, virulent anti-communists, and intelligence assets deeply embedded within the local civic structure. On the morning of November 22nd, flyers were circulating the streets of Dallas bearing the president's face under the heading, "Wanted for Treason." The atmosphere was not merely unwelcoming, it was violently primed. The deep state actively guided their target into the center of this pre-existing storm. The true malice of the operation lay in the deliberate, methodical dismantling of the president's protective shield. The United States Secret Service was designed to be an impenetrable human barrier, a protocol-driven machine that prioritized the biological survival of the president above all else. Yet, as the motorcade prepared to leave Love Field Airport, the fundamental doctrines of executive protection were systematically dismantled. Analyze the security configuration of the presidential limousine, a heavy, unarmored Lincoln Continental. Standard protocol dictated the presence of Secret Service agents riding on the rear bumpers, providing a physical shield and immediate response capability. Furthermore, standard protocol for a motorcade traveling through a hostile urban environment required motorcycle outriders to flank the vehicle, neutralizing the lines of sight from adjacent crowds and buildings. On this specific morning, these protocols were countermanded. Film footage from Love Field clearly shows the Secret Service commander for the motorcade, Agent Emery Roberts, explicitly ordering the agents off the rear bumper of the president's car just as it began to move. The motorcycle outriders were ordered to drop back, leaving the sides and the rear of the vehicle completely exposed. The target was stripped naked. To the untrained eye, this appears as a catastrophic sequence of security failures. To a forensic investigator, it is the deliberate suspension of protocol. You do not accidentally remove human shields from a high-value target in hostile territory. You remove them to clear the lines of sight for the designated shooters. The motorcade proceeded through the downtown quarters of Dallas without incident, lulling the target into a false sense of security. The true architectural brilliance of the ambush awaited at the western edge of the city. Look at the topographical layout of Dealey Plaza. Do not view it as a park or a public square. View it through the lens of a military sniper. Dealey Plaza is a textbook geographical bottleneck. The most direct, logical, and secure route to the president's destination, the Trade Mart, was straight down Main Street, passing through the plaza and under the triple underpass without altering speed. The chosen route to the Trade Mart forced the motorcade into a highly vulnerable tactical position. To access the Stemmons Freeway, the convoy had to navigate a sharp 90-degree right turn from Main Street onto Houston Street, followed immediately by a brutal 120-degree hairpin left turn onto Elm Street. This specific turn is the fulcrum of the entire assassination. A limousine of that length and weight cannot navigate a 120-degree turn at a cruising speed. The driver was forced to brake aggressively. The speed of the vehicle dropped to less than 11 miles per hour. A moving target traveling at 40 miles per hour is a highly complex variable for a marksman. A target traveling at 10 miles per hour, moving steadily away in a straight, predictable line, is a sitting duck. By forcing the motorcade onto Elm Street, the architects of the ambush trapped the vehicle in a geographical funnel. To the left was a vast open plaza, offering no cover. Straight ahead was the triple underpass blocking the forward escape route. To the rear stood the imposing brick facade of the Texas School Book Depository. And to the immediate right front, slightly elevated, was a grassy knoll crowned by a solid wooden picket fence. The target was firmly locked inside the kill zone. The official government report demands that the public accept a narrative of a lone gunman firing an outdated bolt-action Italian rifle from the 6th floor of the book depository. From a purely tactical and military standpoint, relying on a single shooter to execute the commander-in-chief is an operational absurdity. An assassination of this magnitude requires absolute certainty. It requires redundancy. If the single shooter misses, if the rifle jams, or if the target's vehicle suddenly accelerates, the operation fails, the conspiracy is exposed, and the perpetrators face execution for treason. The deep state does not rely on luck. They rely on the mathematics of crossfire. The deployment of shooters in Dealey Plaza utilized a standard military ambush tactic known as triangulation of crossfire. This doctrine dictates placing marksmen at multiple, elevated, opposing angles relative to the target's trajectory. When the target enters the focal point of the triangle, the shooters fire simultaneously. This creates a converging web of ballistics. It divides the attention of the security detail, makes it impossible to determine the origin of the gunfire through acoustics alone due to overlapping echoes, and, most importantly, guarantees that even if the target takes evasive action, they will inevitably move into the path of another bullet. Forensic acoustic analysis, the physical reaction of the victim, and the testimony of over 50 credible eyewitnesses, including combat veterans and police officers, place the shooters in at least 3 distinct locations. First, a team positioned in the rear, utilizing the upper floors of the Texas School Book Depository and the adjacent Daltex building, providing the plunging fire from behind. Second, and most lethally, a frontal shooter positioned behind the wooden picket fence on the grassy knoll. As the Lincoln Continental straightened out on Elm Street, the trap was sprung. The first shots cracked through the crisp November air. The synchronization of the crossfire was designed to overwhelm the senses. A bullet struck the president from the front, entering his throat. A neat small entry wound later corroborated by the frontline trauma doctors at Parkland Hospital. Almost simultaneously, a shot from the rear struck him in the upper back. The president's hands flew to his throat. He did not dive to the floor of the vehicle. He was immobilized by a heavy back brace he wore for chronic pain, a medical detail the organizers of the ambush undoubtedly knew. He was held upright, a perfectly stable target, waiting for the final fatal impact. The security detail froze. The driver of the limousine, Secret Service agent William Greer, did not hit the accelerator. In direct violation of emergency driving protocols, he hit the brakes, bringing the vehicle to a near standstill. He turned his head over his right shoulder, looking directly at the president. He waited. The kill shot did not come from the 6th floor behind them. The fatal impact, captured with horrifying clarity on the Zapruder film, struck the president in the right temple. The physics of the impact are absolute and undeniable. Upon being struck, the president's head and upper body were violently thrown backward and to the left. Sir Isaac Newton's third law of motion dictates that an object struck by a projectile will move in the direction of the projectile's trajectory. A body thrown backward and to the left can only be the result of a projectile fired from the front and to the right. The location front and right of the president at that exact millisecond was the wooden picket fence on the grassy knoll. The skull of the president was shattered, an explosive geyser of blood and brain matter spraying backward over the trunk of the limousine, covering the motorcycle officers trailing the car. The smell of smokeless gunpowder drifted over the plaza. The deed was done. Only after the fatal headshot was delivered did the driver finally turn back to the wheel and accelerate the vehicle toward the underpass. The operation in Dealey Plaza was executed with terrifying, mechanical precision. The target was lured into a hostile environment, stripped of his protective shield, slowed to a crawl in a calculated geographical funnel, and subjected to a triangulated crossfire that ensured a 0% survival rate. The gunfire lasted less than 6 seconds. The physical execution of the president served merely as the kinetic first phase of the operation. The body was now a piece of physical evidence, a biological ledger that contained the undeniable proof of a frontal shooter and a coordinated conspiracy. As the limousine sped toward Parkland Hospital, the architects of the coup immediately shifted their focus from the trigger pullers to the medical examiners. The physical assassination was complete. The assassination of the truth was about to begin. The assassination of a head of state is a profound act of physical violence, but the preservation of the system that ordered it requires an entirely different kind of brutality, the systematic assassination of physical evidence. As the Lincoln Continental sped away from Dealey Plaza, carrying the shattered remains of the 35th president toward Parkland Memorial Hospital, the operational objective of the shadow state shifted instantly. The trigger pullers had completed their assignment. The burden of the coup now fell upon the fixers, the bureaucrats, and the medical examiners. To convince the American public and the global community that this highly coordinated military ambush was the spontaneous act of a lone sociopathic Marxist, the system had to construct a forensic fiction so massive that it defied the fundamental laws of physics. The chilling reality of the aftermath lies in the government's absolute power to mutate facts, forcing men of science to lie and physically carving a false narrative into the victim's flesh. The central pillar holding up the entire architecture of the government's cover-up is the single bullet theory, commonly known as the magic bullet. The invention of this narrative stems directly from a specific mathematical trap the Warren Commission faced at the crime scene. Crime scene investigators found 3 spent shell casings on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. One shot missed the vehicle entirely, its fragment striking a concrete curb and wounding a bystander, James Tague, down the street. The third shot was the fatal headshot. This left exactly 1 bullet to account for every other wound sustained in that limousine. If Governor John Connally, sitting in the jump seat in front of the president, was struck by a separate bullet, it would mean at least 4 shots were fired. 4 shots from a bolt-action rifle in 5.6 seconds is physically impossible for a single human being to achieve. More importantly, 4 shots meant a minimum of 2 shooters. 2 shooters meant a conspiracy. A conspiracy meant a state-sponsored execution. Therefore, the system demanded a miracle. They required a single projectile to execute a ballistic ballet. The official narrative, which the American public was ordered to accept under the threat of being labeled unpatriotic, dictates that a single 6.5 millimeter copper-jacketed bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, struck the president in the upper back. It then exited through his throat. Instead of continuing in a straight line, the bullet supposedly paused in midair, turned to the right, and entered Governor Connolly's right armpit. It drove through his chest, completely shattering his 5th rib. It exited his chest, smashed violently through the dense radius bone of his right wrist, and finally embedded itself deep in his left thigh. A projectile that causes 7 distinct wounds, passes through 2 adult male bodies, and pulverizes 2 separate dense human bones will suffer catastrophic ballistic deformation. It will flatten, it will fragment, it will lose mass. Yet, when CE 399 was miraculously discovered hours later, resting neatly on a stretcher in a Parkland hospital corridor, it was virtually pristine. It was shiny. It had lost no more than 2 grains of its original weight. The copper jacket was fully intact. Under the unforgiving laws of forensic ballistics and fluid dynamics, this is not an anomaly. It is a blasphemy. It is an insult to human intelligence. The men who authored the Warren Report knew it was physically impossible. The intelligence directors who reviewed it knew it was a fabrication. But the truth was a luxury the system could not afford. The magic bullet was not an investigative conclusion. It was a political mandate. The system demonstrated its ultimate cruelty by looking the American public in the eye and demanding they accept a physical impossibility as historical dogma. If the state can force you to believe that a bullet can defy physics, it has achieved total psychological dominance. But a pristine bullet on a stretcher was not enough to secure the cover-up. The most dangerous piece of evidence in the world on the afternoon of November 22nd was the body of the president itself. At Parkland Hospital, the frontline trauma surgeons, men who dealt with gunshot wounds on a daily basis, worked frantically to save the president's life. During their desperate resuscitation efforts, they observed the wounds in their raw, unaltered state. They noted a small, neat puncture wound in the front of the president's throat. In forensic terms, a small, neat hole is an entry wound. They also noted a massive, fist-sized avulsion in the right rear of his skull. In forensic terms, a massive blowout is an exit wound. The medical consensus in Trauma Room 1 was absolute. The president had been struck by crossfire from the front. If a civilian independent medical examiner in Dallas County conducted a legal forensic autopsy and documented an entry wound from the front, the lone gunman narrative would disintegrate instantly. The state of Texas held legal jurisdiction. The assassination of a president was not yet a federal crime, but the shadow state does not respect municipal jurisdiction. In a display of raw federal power, armed Secret Service agents physically confronted the Dallas medical examiner, Dr. Earl Rose. They threatened him, bypassed local law enforcement, forcibly seized the bronze casket during a highly volatile physical altercation, and loaded it onto Air Force One before Lyndon B. Johnson had even taken the oath of office. This was the critical phase of the cover-up. the seizure of the crime scene. The body was flown to the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. It was removed from the civilian domain and placed entirely under the control of the military hierarchy. The autopsy that followed was not a medical procedure aimed at discovering the cause of death. It was a military operation aimed at manufacturing a specific result. The autopsy was not assigned to experienced forensic pathologists who specialize in homicide. It was assigned to Commander James Humes and Commander J. Thornton Boswell, career military hospital administrators who had virtually no experience in forensic gunshot analysis. But they had the one qualification the system required. They knew how to follow orders from superior officers. The autopsy room was packed with admirals, generals, and unidentified intelligence operatives. These commanding officers actively directed the medical procedure. When Dr. Humes attempted to track the trajectory of the back wound with a probe, he was ordered to stop. The wound in the front of the throat, the damning entry wound, had been enlarged by the Parkland doctors for an emergency tracheotomy. The Bethesda doctors were ordered not to dissect the neck to investigate the track. The cover-up escalated drastically when Commander Humes sat down to write his final report. The original draft of his autopsy notes, which likely contained the raw, contradictory observations of the military doctors before the narrative was fully sanitized, was considered an unacceptable risk. Dr. Humes later admitted under oath that he took his original handwritten draft of the president's autopsy report and threw it into the fireplace of his home, watching it burn to ash. The report submitted to the Warren Commission was a sterilized, fabricated document designed to align perfectly with the 3 shell casings found on the 6th floor of the book depository. The deep state had successfully bleached the crime scene. They had intimidated the medical professionals, subverted the legal jurisdiction, and literally carved a false narrative into the flesh of the victim. The Bethesda autopsy revealed a chilling absolute. The state's instinct for self-preservation will easily overwrite any existing medical or moral protocol. They will mutilate a corpse to protect a lie. With the physical evidence successfully altered and the impossible physics of the magic bullet codified into law, the system was ready to move to the next, bloodiest phase of the cover-up. They had to silence the man they had chosen to take the fall. The successful execution of a head of state and the subsequent mutilation of his autopsy report are monumental achievements of systemic power, but they are incomplete without the final, crucial component of any state-sponsored coup, a narrative anchor. The public mind, reeling from the trauma of the event, abhors a vacuum. If left unanswered, the collective grief of a nation will inevitably mutate into dangerous investigative rage. Therefore, the shadow state must immediately provide a sacrificial lamb. This figure must be meticulously constructed to absorb the totality of the public's hatred, thereby shielding the actual architects of the crime from any forensic scrutiny. In the lexicon of covert operations, this figure is known as the patsy. The true nightmare of November 1963 was witnessing how efficiently the state could select a target, rewrite his identity, frame him for treason, and execute him on live television to guarantee his silence. Lee Harvey Oswald was not a lone sociopathic drifter who serendipitously found himself employed at a building overlooking the presidential motorcade route. To view him as such is to willingly ignore a labyrinth of highly classified intelligence files that paint a profoundly different picture. Oswald was a curated asset, a man whose entire adult life was managed and manipulated by the very intelligence agencies that would later frame him. Look at the timeline of his existence not as a biography, but as the construction of an intelligence legend. He was a former Marine trained in radar operations at the highly classified Atsugi base in Japan, a launch site for the CIA's U-2 spy planes. At the height of the Cold War, he supposedly defected to the Soviet Union, offering radar secrets to the KGB. Yet, when he grew tired of life in Minsk, the United States government did not prosecute him for treason. They did not interrogate him in a dark room. The State Department gave him a loan to travel back to the United States with his Russian wife, smoothing his re-entry into the country seamlessly. This is not the trajectory of a Marxist traitor. This is the operational footprint of an intelligence asset participating in a fake defection program. Upon his return, Oswald's associations were exclusively with men deeply embedded in the anti-Castro movement, the CIA, and organized crime. In New Orleans, his base of operations was located in the same building as Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent heavily involved in CIA-sponsored anti-Castro paramilitaries. He associated with David Ferry, a pilot and CIA contractor deeply entangled with the Carlos Marcello Mafia syndicate. The system spent years building Oswald's profile, simultaneously planting evidence of his pro-communist sympathies while surrounding him with right-wing intelligence assets. They were building a ghost, a man who could be presented to the world as a radical communist, thereby terrifying the American public into accepting his guilt without demanding a trial. On the afternoon of November 22nd, the trap was sprung. The rifle found on the 6th floor of the Texas Schoolbook Depository was traced to a mail-order purchase made under an alias allegedly tied to Oswald. But the physical execution of the frame-up was shockingly flawed, revealing the arrogance of a system that believed it controlled the media entirely. Oswald's behavior upon arrest was entirely inconsistent with the psychological profile of a political assassin. A fanatic who murders a world leader to make an ideological point desires a platform. He wants to claim the glory of his actions to inspire his movement. When Oswald was paraded before the flashbulbs of the Global Press Corps in the halls of the Dallas Police Department, he looked battered, bewildered, and terrified. He did not claim the kill. He shouted, his voice cracking with the genuine desperation of a man who suddenly realizes the fatal architecture of his own existence. "I didn't shoot anybody. I'm just a patsy." Oswald's panic in front of the cameras was not the reaction of an ideological martyr. It was the visceral shock of a covert operative realizing he had just been burned by his own handlers. Oswald, who likely believed he was participating in an intelligence operation, perhaps tracking gun runners or monitoring a simulated threat, suddenly realized he was not the operative. He was the target. The system had locked the door behind him. The forensic evidence supported his panicked declaration. On the night of the assassination, the Dallas police administered a paraffin test to Oswald's hands and right cheek. The test is designed to detect the presence of barium and antimony, the chemical residues deposited on the skin when a firearm is discharged. While his hands tested positive, consistent with a man who had been handling materials or was involved in a brief scuffle with a police officer in a theater, the test on his right cheek came back entirely negative. In the eyes of his defense advocates, the absence of gunshot residue on his face strongly contradicted the profile of a man who had just fired an extended volley from a high-powered rifle. The physical proof of his innocence was recorded, filed, and immediately suppressed by the authorities. The architects of the coup were well aware of these evidentiary vulnerabilities. They knew that a living patsy was a catastrophic liability. If Oswald survived the weekend to secure legal counsel, the entire cover-up would collapse. A competent defense attorney would subpoena his intelligence files, demand the suppressed paraffin test results, cross-examine the witnesses who saw shooters on the grassy knoll, and expose the deep ties between Oswald and the CIA. The courtroom would become an autopsy table for the shadow state. Therefore, Oswald could not go to trial. He had to be silenced, and the execution had to be public to provide the psychological closure the system demanded for the American people. This operational imperative required the activation of a cleaner. Enter Jack Ruby, a man presented to the public by the Warren Commission as an emotionally unstable, patriotic nightclub owner who killed Oswald out of a deep love for the Kennedy family, wishing to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the trauma of a trial. This narrative is a grotesque fiction. Jack Ruby was a hardened, mid-level operative for the Chicago outfit, deeply connected to mafia boss Sam Giancana and New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello. Ruby ran strip clubs, managed gambling operations, and served as a bagman, moving illicit cash across state lines. Crucially, he had intimate, documented relationships with dozens of officers within the Dallas Police Department, providing them with free alcohol, women, and favors. He was a creature of the underworld, entirely dependent on the goodwill of the police and the mob to survive. He did not act out of grief. He acted to fulfill a contract, knowing that to refuse an order from the syndicate was a death sentence. The logistics of Oswald's execution on Sunday, November 24th, represent the pinnacle of systemic complicity. The transfer of the accused presidential assassin from the city jail to the county jail should have been the most heavily secured logistical movement in the country. The basement of the Dallas Police headquarters was allegedly locked down, swarming with armed detectives and armored vehicles. Yet Jack Ruby simply walked down the concrete ramp from Main Street, entirely unimpeded by the officers he had bribed for years. As Oswald was led out in handcuffs, flanked by detectives, the cameras rolled, broadcasting the feed live to millions of American living rooms. Ruby stepped out from the perimeter of reporters. He did not hesitate. He thrust a .38 caliber snub-nosed revolver directly into Oswald's abdomen and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the concrete basement, but its psychological reverberation shattered the consciousness of the nation. Oswald slumped to the floor, his life violently extinguished, taking the secrets of his intelligence handlers and the true architecture of the Dealey Plaza ambush to the grave. The system had achieved total victory. By executing the scapegoat on live television, they achieved a terrifying duality. They severed the only investigative link to the true conspirators, and they traumatized the American public into a state of paralyzed acceptance. The visual of Oswald dying on the concrete floor was the ultimate display of absolute power. The message from the shadow state was unwritten but undeniably clear. We have killed the president. We have killed the man we blamed for it. The file is closed. Do not ask questions. With the trigger men vanished, the autopsy sanitized, and the patsy in the morgue, the final phase of the operation could commence. The system now had to institutionalize the lie, weaponize the media, and seal the truth in a vault so deep it would outlive the very people who demanded it. The physical executions of November 1963, the public slaughter of the president, and the televised murder of his designated scapegoat were merely the kinetic phases of the operation. Blood had been spilled, the target was eliminated, and the immediate loose end had been severed. But the shadow state understands that physical violence is ephemeral. It is the control of history that guarantees permanent power. As the winter of 1963 settled over a traumatized, grieving nation, the architects of the coup transitioned from tactical assassination to comprehensive psychological warfare. The objective was no longer the elimination of a man, it was the subjugation of the collective American mind. The lasting damage of this era is not found in the gunfire, but in the methodical, systemic gaslighting of the American public. It is the chilling realization that the state possesses the apparatus to look millions of citizens in the eye, present them with an undeniable physical impossibility, and demand their absolute belief under the threat of social annihilation. The primary instrument of this psychological subjugation was the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, universally known as the Warren Commission. To the naive observer, the creation of a blue ribbon panel led by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court appeared as a noble pursuit of transparency. To the forensic analyst, it was a brilliantly constructed mechanism of containment. President Lyndon B. Johnson did not assemble the commission to investigate the murder. He assembled it to certify the pre-written conclusion of the lone gunman. The arrogance of the deep state is most glaring in its selection of the inquisitors. Among the men appointed to uncover the truth behind the president's death was Allen Dulles, the very same director of Central Intelligence whom Kennedy had humiliated, fired, and vowed to destroy after the Bay of Pigs. The system essentially placed the prime suspect on the jury. Dulles used his position to actively steer the investigation away from the CIA, suppressing evidence, manipulating witnesses, and ensuring the shadow state remained invisible. The methodology of the Warren Commission was an affront to fundamental jurisprudence. It operated as a defense attorney for the official narrative rather than an impartial prosecutor of the facts. When confronted with the glaring contradictions of the autopsy report, the commission did not demand the exhumation of the body. They accepted the sanitized, military-drafted summaries. When presented with the physical impossibility of a single bullet causing 7 wounds, they simply redefined the laws of physics, codifying the magic bullet into the historical record. Most egregiously, they actively suppressed the testimony of the citizens who were actually present in Dealey Plaza. Over 50 credible eyewitnesses, including Dallas police officers and combat veterans trained to identify the origin of gunfire, swore under oath that they heard shots and saw gun smoke originating from behind the wooden picket fence on the grassy knoll. The commission systematically ignored, altered, or buried their testimonies. The psychological assault on these witnesses was absolute. Ordinary citizens who had just watched a coup were systematically ordered by their government to disbelieve their own eyes and ears. However, despite the massive institutional weight behind the Warren Report, the sheer volume of its internal contradictions began to buckle under the scrutiny of independent researchers. By the mid-1960s, a quiet but potent wave of skepticism was rising among the American public. Lawyers, journalists, and ordinary citizens began to read the 26 volumes of supplemental hearings, discovering the buried anomalies and the forensic impossibilities. The deep state realized that burying the evidence was not enough. They had to proactively destroy the credibility of anyone who dared to question the narrative. They had to quarantine the skepticism before it mutated into a demand for a new independent investigation. This operational necessity gave birth to one of the most successful psychological weapons of the 20th century. In April 1967, the Central Intelligence Agency issued a highly classified directive to its media assets known as Dispatch 1035-960. This document explicitly outlined a strategy to combat the growing criticism of the Warren Report. It instructed operatives to utilize covert assets within the press, television, and academia to systematically smear independent investigators. The Dispatch directed the media to label critics as irrational, paranoid, and financially motivated, thereby cementing a cultural stigma around questioning the official narrative. The psychological destruction engineered by this tactic was absolute. The shadow state commits a monumental crime, and when a citizen points out the glaring inconsistencies of the official story, the state utilizes its media apparatus to label that citizen as mentally unstable. To question the official narrative was to invite total systemic isolation. To question the official narrative of the Kennedy assassination was to risk professional ruin, social ostracization, and public ridicule. The system did not need to debate the ballistics or the autopsy anomalies. It simply needed to condition the American public to immediately dismiss anyone who brought them up. They hacked the cultural operating system, ensuring that the truth would be perceived as a symptom of madness. But psychological warfare was only reserved for those who merely wrote books or asked questions. For those who possessed actual first-hand knowledge of the operational logistics in Dallas, the system relied on a much older, more permanent method of containment. In the years immediately following the assassination, a terrifying, statistically impossible mortality rate began to decimate the ranks of crucial witnesses, intelligence assets, and peripheral players associated with the case. This was the silent, brutal, mopping up phase of the operation. Consider the mathematics of mortality. Lee Bowers, a railway tower switchman who had a commanding view of the grassy knoll and testified to seeing unfamiliar men in a flash of light behind the picket fence, died when his car inexplicably veered into a bridge abutment on an empty road. Dorothy Kilgallen, a prominent investigative journalist who had secured a private, exclusive interview with Jack Ruby during his trial and told friends she was about to blow the JFK case sky high, was found dead in her Manhattan apartment from a highly suspicious fatal combination of alcohol and barbiturates. The folder containing her extensive notes on the assassination vanished and was never recovered. David Ferry, the CIA contractor and deep associate of Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans, was found dead in his apartment just days after it was announced he was a primary target in District Attorney Jim Garrison's investigation into the assassination. The list expands into the dozens. Key witnesses succumbing to sudden heart attacks, mysterious suicides, unsolved murders, and violent accidents. The staggering mortality rate among key witnesses sparked intense public suspicion. While the House Select Committee on Assassinations later attributed these numbers to statistical probability across a massive pool of individuals, for independent investigators, this trail of dead witnesses served as a chilling, unspoken warning. The math becomes paralyzing. It exposes a shadow state that does not merely redact documents, but actively prunes the human population to bury its secrets. The trail of dead witnesses served as a chilling, unspoken warning to anyone else who might be contemplating breaking their silence. The message was written in blood across the country. The operation did not end in Dallas. The machinery of execution was still active, still vigilant, and entirely unconstrained by the rule of law. By the end of the 1960s, the vault had been successfully sealed. The physical evidence had been destroyed or locked away in the National Archives, classified for 75 years under the guise of national security. The scapegoat was buried. The witnesses were either terrified into silence or resting in early graves. And the American public had been psychologically conditioned to reject their own intuition, trained to recoil from the truth, lest they be labeled conspiracy theorists. The deep state had achieved absolute narrative dominance. They had murdered a president and successfully convinced the nation that it was the tragic, unavoidable act of a lone madman. The psychological legacy of this era is that of a conquered people, a nation intuitively aware it was violently overthrown from within, yet too paralyzed by the implications to speak it aloud. The system had proven its invincibility. The final phase of the tragedy was not the assassination itself, but the dark, enduring legacy it would leave for the future of the Republic. The transition of absolute power does not occur in a voting booth. It occurs in the immediate violent vacuum left by a deposed leader. The true magnitude of the deep state's victory materialized hours later, far from the blood-stained asphalt of Dealey Plaza, inside the cold, sterile cabin of Air Force One. While the shattered body of John F. Kennedy lay in a bronze casket in the aft compartment, Lyndon B. Johnson stood in the center of the aircraft, raising his right hand to take the oath of office. The visual juxtaposition is the ultimate testament to the system's brutal efficiency. The idealist, the man who dared to challenge the permanent national security apparatus, was reduced to biological cargo. The pragmatist, a man deeply entrenched in the Texas political machine and intimately aligned with the military-industrial complex, was elevated to the highest office in the land. The shadow state did not merely eliminate a threat, they installed a compliant successor. The physical assassination was over. The policy assassination was about to begin. The primary motive for the coup d'etat was never personal animosity. It was the preservation of a multi-billion-dollar economic engine fueled by perpetual warfare. The foundational ruthlessness of the American empire is dictated entirely by its balance sheets. For the defense contractors, the intelligence agencies, and the Pentagon brass, peace is not a diplomatic achievement. It is a catastrophic market failure. Kennedy's greatest sin was his active pursuit of that failure. He had negotiated with the Soviets, signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and, most unforgivably, initiated the withdrawal of American military personnel from Southeast Asia. The reversal of this trajectory was the immediate unwritten condition of the new presidency. The speed at which Kennedy's peace initiatives were dismantled reveals the true architecture of the coup. On November 26, 1963, a mere 4 days after the assassination, while the nation was still paralyzed by the televised funeral, President Johnson signed National Security Action Memorandum 273. This highly classified document quietly but definitively reversed Kennedy's withdrawal plan. It authorized the escalation of covert operations against North Vietnam and laid the bureaucratic groundwork for the introduction of hundreds of thousands of combat troops. This is the definitive cui bono, the answer to who benefits. The murder in Dallas was, at its core, a highly successful, aggressively hostile corporate takeover. The moment NSAM 273 was signed, the financial arteries of the military-industrial complex were reopened. The defense contractors, who had watched their stocks plummet under Kennedy's peace directives, suddenly saw a horizon of infinite profitability. Companies manufacturing Bell helicopters, M16 rifles, napalm, and Agent Orange secured contracts worth tens of billions of dollars. Brown and Root, a massive Texas-based engineering firm with deep ties to Johnson, secured exclusive logistical contracts to build the military infrastructure in Vietnam. The 58,000 American soldiers who eventually died in Southeast Asia, alongside millions of Vietnamese civilians, were the collateral damage of the Dealey Plaza ambush. They were drafted into a meat grinder because the man who tried to dismantle it was executed in broad daylight, their blood paying the immediate dividends for the Shadow State's war economy. The systemic trauma inflicted upon the American Republic extends far beyond the casualties of the ensuing wars. The assassination of John F. Kennedy fundamentally altered the psychological relationship between the governed and the government. For the generation that lived through it, the citizens who watched the motorcade, who saw the accused assassin murdered on live television, and who were subsequently told by the Warren Commission to ignore their own eyes and ears. The realization was slow, corrosive, and deeply terrifying. It was the realization that the democratic process is a managed illusion. The deep state demonstrated that the President of the United States is not the sovereign leader of the free world. The President is a middle manager. If the manager aligns with the strategic and financial interests of the permanent security apparatus, he is permitted to govern. If he challenges the core directives of the empire, if he attempts to rein in the intelligence agencies or disrupt the war economy, he will be removed. The assassination served as a permanent, unspoken warning to every man who has occupied the Oval Office since 1963. You may debate tax policy, you may debate domestic health care, but you do not challenge the national security state. The system proved that it possesses the operational capability to execute the commander-in-chief, the logistical power to completely sanitize the physical evidence, and the media control to psychologically subjugate the entire population into accepting a physical impossibility. As the decades passed, the cracks in the official narrative became impossible to ignore. In the late 1970s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations was forced to officially reopen the investigation due to overwhelming public pressure and the exposure of massive illegal CIA operations. The committee utilized modern acoustic analysis of a police dictabelt recording from Dealey Plaza. The scientific conclusion was undeniable. There were at least 4 shots fired, and at least 1 shot originated from the grassy knoll. The United States government, 14 years after the fact, was forced to officially admit that John F. Kennedy was likely assassinated as the result of a conspiracy. Yet the invulnerability of the system remained absolute. They admitted to a conspiracy, but they flatly refused to identify the conspirators. They blamed the mafia, they blamed rogue elements, but they meticulously shielded the institutional hierarchy of the CIA and the Pentagon. They investigated themselves, admitted a fraction of the truth to pacify the public, and then immediately sealed the newly discovered files away from independent scrutiny. The shadow state granted itself a permanent pardon. They demonstrated that even when caught, even when the forensic impossibility of their cover-up is scientifically proven, they are entirely immune to the mechanisms of justice. The legacy of Dealey Plaza is not a historical mystery. It is a blueprint of modern authoritarianism, operating under the guise of a constitutional republic. The deep state did not vanish after 1963. It evolved, emboldened by its ultimate victory. The intelligence agencies that orchestrated the cover-up expanded their reach, utilizing the same tactics of media manipulation, domestic surveillance, and covert violence to manage the American empire for the next 60 years. The weaponization of the term conspiracy theory continues to be used today to silence dissent and marginalize anyone who questions the official narratives of the state. When you strip away the mythology of Camelot, the endless debates over bullet trajectories, and the tragedy of a grieving widow, what remains is a cold, hard, and terrifying reality. John F. Kennedy fell as a political casualty in a ruthless war for control of the American state. He looked into the abyss of the military-industrial complex, recognized it as a terminal threat to the survival of humanity, and attempted to dismantle it. The machine simply ground him into dust. The enduring nightmare of the John F. Kennedy assassination lies in the absolute perfection of the crime. It is the chilling realization that ultimate power does not reside in the illuminated halls of the White House or the chambers of Congress. Ultimate power resides in the shadows, wielded by unnamed men who view the law as an obstacle, human life as a statistic, and truth as a highly malleable commodity. If the system can blow off the head of the most powerful elected official on earth in the middle of a sunny afternoon, execute the designated scapegoat in a room full of police officers, rewrite the laws of physics in the official record, and successfully order a nation of 300 million people to accept a lie, then the social contract is void. The republic is a theater piece, and absolutely no one, anywhere, is safe